What the hell is that?
Catherine Whitmore tossed the charcoal drawing onto the table as if contaminated. Amara Reed flinched.
Teacher, I spent 3 nights on it.
3 nights wasted on trash.
For the first time in 4 years, Amara looked up, directly at her teacher.
That drawing isn't trash.
Whitmore's smile vanished, her face flushed.
What did you say?
Please give it back.
Amara stood up. 18 years old, painfully shy, hands trembling but voice steady for the first time. Whitmore snatched it first.
What do garbage rats know about art?
She walked into the middle of the class and held it up.
This trash isn't worth $1.
Then she tore it in half. A girl giggled. Amara stared in stunned silence. But Ms. Whitmore had no idea how much that torn painting would soon be worth. Carrington Institute of Fine Arts sits on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a Beaux-Arts fortress where charcoal dust drifts through tall windows and the names of dead artists are carved into the limestone above the doors. Every spring, 12 seniors are chosen for the Cornerstone exhibition, a gallery night so prestigious that curators from MoMA and Christie's mark their calendars for it months in advance. One spot in that show could launch a career. 12 spots, 12 futures. And the woman who chose them was Catherine Whitmore. Amara Reed was a fourth-year senior, the only black student in her cohort, the only one on the Founders Scholarship, awarded once per class to a student whose family income fell below the poverty line. At 6 every morning, she boarded the 6 train from Hunts Point in the South Bronx, headphones in but no music playing, only silence, to keep strangers from speaking to her. In her backpack, she carried 2 things: a leather-bound sketchbook with the initials L.R. embossed into the spine, and a peanut butter sandwich her mother had wrapped in newspaper because they could not afford foil. Her mother, Yolanda Reed, was 38 years old and looked 50. She worked the day shift at Bronx General Hospital scrubbing operating rooms and the night shift at a downtown law firm emptying trash bins until 2 in the morning. She had not slept more than 5 hours in a single stretch since Amara turned 6. Her hands were cracked from industrial bleach. Her knees swelled every winter. The month before, the landlord had threatened eviction over $1,800 in back rent. Yolanda had paid it by selling her own mother's wedding ring, the last thing of value in their apartment. The grandmother, Loretta Reed, had died in 2004 in a public hospital, drawing in that same leather sketchbook until the morphine took her hand. In life, she had been a painter nobody bought. In death, she had left her granddaughter one sentence, written in shaky pencil on the inside cover. Draw instead of speaking. Don't let anyone force you to talk. So Amara did. She had not voluntarily raised her hand in 4 years at Carrington. She sat in the back right corner of every studio, near the window when allowed, and near the air conditioner when not. She had no friends. She drew. But what no one in that building knew, not even Amara herself, was that she could look at a stranger for 30 seconds and remember the face 6 months later, down to the smallest tremor of grief in the corner of the mouth. She saw emotion as color, the way her grandmother had. She drew shadow like Rembrandt without ever having been taught, and she could finish a complete psychological portrait in 23 minutes. The woman in charge of the Cornerstone selection was 45 years old, daughter of Harold Whitmore, the late Madison Avenue gallerist whose 1985 roster had quietly excluded every black female painter who walked through his doors. Catherine herself had failed as a painter in the 1990s and had reinvented herself as a gatekeeper. She wore cashmere in every season. She called her favorite student, Brittany Sinclair, my European soul. Brittany's father was the largest donor to the school's endowment. On the first day of senior portfolio class, Whitmore assigned a 90-minute timed sketch, a live model, full body, charcoal. Amara finished in 23 minutes. She put her pencil down and folded her hands in her lap. Whitmore walked past her desk, glanced down, stopped. For 4 seconds, she said nothing. Then her jaw tightened. She recognized the style, the same shadow work, the same psychological cut. She had seen it once before, in a slim 1983 Soho catalog her father had kept on a high shelf, the spine cracked from being thrown across a room. "You finished early because you worked carelessly," Whitmore said at last. "Do it again." Amara did not argue. She flipped to a fresh page and began again from the start. Brittany Sinclair, 2 rows up, smirked into her sleeve. But there was someone Amara did not know about yet. 2 floors below that classroom, behind an unmarked door at the end of a dim hallway, a 60-year-old man named Theodore Bennett was unlocking his basement studio for the day. 43 years earlier, as a young assistant curator in Soho, he had hung a small show by a painter named Loretta Reed. The gallery had closed 18 days later. Nobody bought a single piece. He had never forgotten her name. And he was about to open the door to her granddaughter. The torn portrait on the classroom floor did not happen in a single afternoon. It happened over 4 weeks. 4 weeks of small cuts, each one designed to draw a little more blood than the last. The first week, Catherine Whitmore stopped at every desk in the studio for her morning critiques. At Brittany Sinclair's easel, she lingered 8 full minutes, leaning in, murmuring about Mediterranean light and European bones. At Amara's desk, she paused for 4 seconds. She did not look down at the drawing. She did not speak. She walked on. Brittany turned in her seat and smiled at the girl beside her. The girl smiled back. Both of them glanced toward Amara, and both of them looked away again, as though she were already invisible. That same Friday, Whitmore announced a private workshop with a visiting curator from the Whitney. 12 students invited, names read from a list. Amara waited for hers. The list ended without it. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap, and decided to ask. After class, she walked to the chairwoman's office, knocked. No answer. Knocked again, softer. Stood in the hallway for 18 minutes, watching the second hand on the wall clock complete its circle 3 full times. Through the frosted glass, she could see Whitmore's shape at the desk, moving, picking up a phone, putting it down. The door never opened. That weekend, through a classmate's social media, Amara learned that 13 students had attended the workshop. Brittany had been added at the last minute. The second week, Whitmore rearranged the studio. She announced it as a fairness measure. Amara's seat by the tall north window was given to a freshman transfer. Amara's new seat was in the back corner, beside an air conditioning vent that rattled every 90 seconds. The natural light there was the worst in the room, gray and flat, the kind that flattens a drawing before the artist can even finish it. Amara raised her hand. She wanted to ask if the seats could rotate weekly. Whitmore was speaking to Brittany about a gallery opening in Chelsea and did not turn around. Amara held her hand up for 40 seconds, then lowered it, then sat down in the dark corner without a word. That same week, she submitted a self-portrait. It was the best work of her life. She had used the back of her own hand as a mirror, drawing the shadow of her wrist falling across her cheekbone. Whitmore could not locate it in the stack of submissions. 2 weeks later, a janitor found it in a hallway trash bin near the staff lounge. Brittany had reportedly seen it there and said, "Oh, that's awkward." Amara redrew the portrait from memory. The second one was harder than the first. The first had been hers. The second was a copy of a memory of hers. And the difference, she felt in her chest, was the difference between living and being remembered. By the third week, the cruelty was no longer quiet. "Class, gather around. I want to talk about this one." Whitmore lifted Amara's 23-minute portrait off the easel and held it up like a specimen. The class circled in. Amara stayed seated. "This is what we call untrained instinct. Some students confuse speed with skill. A real artist takes time. This kind of work belongs in a subway station, not in this institution." Class dismissed. A boy in the back laughed out loud. 2 others joined him. Amara did not move until the room was empty. That afternoon in the hallway, Whitmore stood with another faculty member and spoke just loudly enough to be heard at the water fountain where Amara was filling a bottle. "It's the scholarship students," she said. "Some of them belong in trade schools, not fine art programs. It's not cruelty. It's reality." Amara turned the faucet off, walked away, did not drink. Her hand was shaking so badly the bottle was only half full when she reached her locker. On Thursday of that week, Whitmore noticed the leather sketchbook on Amara's desk. She picked it up. She lifted it for the class to inspect. "Look at this. Vintage Goodwill aesthetic. Very authentic, but authentic doesn't mean good. Authentic just means cheap." Brittany giggled into her hand. Whitmore flipped the sketchbook over. Her eyes caught the corner of the inside cover. 3 faint pencil letters. L.R. Loretta Reed. For 2 full seconds, Catherine Whitmore stopped breathing. Then she set the book down, very gently, as though it had teeth. That Friday, she gave the cruelest assignment yet. Each student would stand in front of the class and defend their work in their own words. Amara was called first. She stood. She opened her mouth. 47 seconds passed. Not a sound. Her face went hot. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. The clock on the wall ticked through the silence and made it longer. Whitmore smiled, the dignified, terrible smile she had perfected over 20 years of teaching. "Talent without voice is just decoration, dear. And decoration goes in the trash. Sit down." Brittany giggled, loud enough for the back row to hear. That night in the South Bronx, Amara did not eat dinner. She sat at the kitchen table while her mother slept on the couch in her work uniform, one shoe still on. Amara opened the leather sketchbook. She turned to a fresh page, a page her grandmother had never touched, and she began to draw her mother. For 3 nights, she did not sleep. She drew the swollen knees, the cracked hands, the mop tilted against the chair, the line of exhaustion that ran from the corner of Yolanda's mouth down into the seam of her uniform. She drew the bruise on her mother's forearm where a supervisor had grabbed her too hard the week before. She used techniques she had never been taught. She used shadow the way her grandmother had used it 40 years earlier, as language, not as decoration. On the 4th morning, she carried the drawing to the Carrington Institute. She set it carefully on her desk. She waited for Catherine Whitmore to walk in. Whitmore walked in. She crossed the studio. She stopped at Amara's desk. She picked up the drawing with 2 fingers. She tossed it back onto the table. "What the hell is that?" And the rest. You already know. What you do not yet know is what happened 10 minutes after the door closed behind her. When Amara, still carrying the torn halves of her mother's face in a folded handkerchief, did not go home. She walked down 2 flights of stairs to the end of a dim hallway and pushed open an unmarked door she had been quietly opening every afternoon for 4 months. The door at the end of the basement hallway had no number, no name, no sign. The first time Amara had pushed it open, 4 months earlier, lost in a search for an alumni gallery, she had expected a janitor's closet. Instead, she had found a 60-year-old man bent over a small, water-stained painting, holding a sheet of Japanese tissue between his teeth. He had not looked up. He had only said, "The door closes if you walk out. The door stays open if you sit down." She had sat down. She had stayed 90 minutes. She had said nothing. He had said nothing. The next week, she returned with the leather sketchbook. He glanced at the spine. He saw the letters L.R. He did not flinch. He did not ask. He only slid open a drawer beneath his desk and pushed a box of Italian charcoal across the work table. "Number 4 is softer on skin," he said. "Try it." His name was Theodore Bennett. 43 years earlier, fresh out of graduate school, he had hung a small Soho show by a painter named Loretta Reed. The gallery had closed 18 days later. He had spent a part of every year since wondering if he should have fought harder for her. For 4 months, Amara had come to his studio 4 or 5 afternoons a week. She entered without knocking. She sat in her usual chair. They traded notes on scraps of paper. He left catalogs on her chair. Ketha Koldvitz, Charles White, Elizabeth Catlett, and one slim volume from 1983 with Loretta's name on the cover. He never spoke about Whitmore. He knew the woman. He knew the system. He knew that to defend the girl too publicly, too early, would only get her crushed faster. So he gave her the things he could give without being seen: paper, charcoal, silence, a roof. On the afternoon of the tearing, Amara pushed the door open with both hands. She did not knock. She walked to the work table. She opened her backpack. She unfolded the handkerchief and laid the 2 halves of her mother's portrait on the wood between them. Bennett looked at the halves. He looked at her. He looked at the halves again. Then he placed one weathered palm flat on the edge of the table and held it there for a long time. "Go home and sleep," he said at last. "I will take care of it." She walked home, took the 6 train north, sat across from her mother on the apartment couch while Yolanda dozed in her uniform with one shoe still on. Amara did not tell her what had happened. She only touched her mother's wrist very lightly and watched the rise and fall of her chest. In the basement, Bennett began the restoration the same night. He used kozo paper from Japan, wheat paste hand-mixed in a copper bowl, and an invisible mending technique he had learned in Florence in 1986. He worked alone, after the building emptied, under a single warm lamp. On the 3rd night, around 2 in the morning, he stopped. He had been aligning the upper half of the drawing, the curve of Yolanda's cheek where she had fallen asleep against the folding chair. The lamp caught the line of her mouth, the exhaustion in it, the mop handle, the bruise on her forearm. Bennett's mother had died in 1979. She had been a night shift cleaner at a Catholic school in Newark. She had also fallen asleep with one shoe on. He put down the bone folder. He sat very still on the wooden stool. And then, for the first time in many years, the man wept in the basement of the Carrington Institute, with no one to see him and no one to ask why. He finished the restoration in 12 nights. One small piece, a fragment from the lower left corner, was missing. He understood where it was. He did not chase it. He cut a clean square of kozo paper and inlaid it as a blank, untouched, white. "If someone tried to erase her," he said to the empty room, "the erasure stays, as evidence." 2 days later, an old friend from Florence, a curator named Margaret Holloway, stopped by his studio to deliver a book. She saw the drawing leaning in a corner. She stared at it for 4 minutes without speaking. "Theo, who drew this?" "A student." Holloway shook her head slowly. "No, this is someone I need to meet." Amara did not know what to say to a stranger in a curator's coat, so she said almost nothing at all. Margaret Holloway sat across from her in the basement studio that evening, asked nothing about technique, asked nothing about influences. She asked instead about Yolanda, about the leather sketchbook, about the difference between drawing somebody and remembering them. For 2 hours they spoke. Amara answered in short sentences, eyes on her own hands. When Holloway stood to leave, she set a single business card on the work table. "I am working on next year's Whitney Biennial," she said. "Inheritance, voices across generations. I want this drawing in it, and I want a few more from the same hand. Bennett knows how to reach me." Then she walked out. The basement door clicked shut behind her. Amara stared at the card for a long time before she could pick it up. That night, on the 6 train going home, she rode past her stop, got off at Pelham Bay, walked the platform until she could breathe again. Something had cracked open inside her. Not a sound, a shape. She walked home through the cold and sat at the kitchen table at midnight and started a new series in the sketchbook her grandmother had left her. She gave it a name on the first page. Hands that built America. She drew the Dominican woman who sold her sandwich bread on 138th Street. She drew the Bangladeshi man who drove the night bus along Bruckner Boulevard. She drew the Filipino nurse who held her mother's elbow in the hospital corridor when Yolanda's knees gave out on a double shift. She drew the cleaner on the 7th floor of a midtown law firm, sleeping for 15 minutes inside a supply closet between rounds. She did not interview her subjects. She watched them from a distance for 30 seconds and then drew them from memory, alone in the basement, in 23 minutes or less. Bennett recorded the times in a private notebook. He had never seen anything like it in 40 years of teaching. A senior curator at the new museum stumbled across the Instagram account by accident. 84 followers became 38,000 in 5 days. The handle was anonymous. Amara turned her notifications off and gave the phone to her mother. Yolanda kept it in her uniform pocket during her night shifts, watching the heart icon tick upward in the elevator between floors. But the heart icon was visible from inside the building, too. And Catherine Whitmore was not stupid. A janitor at Carrington, a woman who had once worked the same hospital corridor as Yolanda, mentioned offhandedly in the staff break room that some important lady had been seen visiting the basement after hours. Whitmore did not blink at the news. She finished her coffee. She walked back to her office. She opened her laptop. The next morning, she summoned Amara to her office. "Sit down, dear." Amara sat. "Tell me, in your own words, why you believe your work belongs in the Cornerstone exhibition. Take your time." The clock on the wall began to tick. Amara opened her mouth. Her tongue stuck. Her face went hot. She tried to push a sound out. There was no sound. 47 seconds passed, then a minute, then a minute 20. Whitmore smiled gently and wrote something in a leather-bound notebook. "Student unable to articulate artistic intent in defense of her own work. I will be recommending a portfolio review with the dean." Amara walked out without speaking. She did not cry until she reached the staircase. Then she sat on the 3rd step from the top and pressed both hands to her face and made no sound at all. That afternoon, Whitmore went over the dean's head and over his head again. She called the chair of the Board of Trustees, a man whose annual giving check had been signed personally by Brittany Sinclair's father for the last 11 years. She framed it as a discipline issue, unauthorized use of studio space after hours, possible plagiarism given the stylistic anomalies of the recent submissions, a student who refused to speak in her own defense. By Friday, a letter arrived at Amara's locker. 2-week suspension pending portfolio review. Yolanda found the letter that evening when she went to wake her daughter for dinner. She read it twice. She did not say a word. She put on her coat. She walked 70 blocks south through the cold rather than spend the subway fare, and stood in front of the Carrington Institute at 9 at night with the letter in her hand, looking up at the dark windows. She did not go inside. She did not know how. She walked home. That same Friday, 320 miles away in a conference room at the Whitney Museum, Margaret Holloway closed the meeting of the Biennial Selection Committee. They had a final acceptance to send. The chair signed the letter. The email went out at 5:47 in the afternoon. The subject line read, "Congratulations from the Whitney Museum of American Art." Amara opened it on the staircase outside the Carrington Institute, the suspension notice still folded in her left hand, the Whitney email glowing on the phone in her right. One sheet of paper telling her she was less than nothing. One screen telling her she was about to be hung on a wall in a museum that 20 million people had walked through. She called her mother. Yolanda picked up on the second ring, breathing hard, somewhere in the hallway of Bronx General between rooms. "Mom?" "Baby, what's wrong?" "I'm in the Whitney." There was a silence on the line. Long. Then Yolanda made a sound her daughter had never heard her make in 18 years of being her daughter. It was not a word. It was not a cry. It was the sound a person makes when they have carried a weight for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "Who did you draw?" Yolanda asked finally. "You, Mama. I drew you." The line went quiet again. And in the bright hallway of a Bronx hospital, leaning against a wall, a tired woman in a janitor's uniform let herself cry for the first time in many years. But Catherine Whitmore had not yet read the morning paper, and the next day, the New York Times was going to print a story that would tear her entire life in half. The headline ran on the front page of the Saturday Arts section. Inheritance. Whitney Biennial discovers a lineage hidden in plain sight. Beneath it, 3 photographs. On the left, Amara's restored portrait of her mother, the blank square of Kozo paper visible in the lower left corner like a wound that refused to close. On the right, a black and white image from 1983 of a charcoal study by a forgotten painter named Loretta Reed. Between them, a third photograph, taken in secret by Theodore Bennett, showing the 2 halves of the original drawing on the moment they had been laid on his work table, torn cleanly down the middle. The article ran 900 words. The first paragraph identified Amara Reed, 18 years old, scholarship senior at the Carrington Institute, granddaughter of a painter who had been quietly excluded from the New York gallery system in the mid-1980s by a man named Harold Whitmore. The second paragraph identified the daughter of Harold Whitmore, current department chair of the Carrington Institute, who had torn the granddaughter's portrait in half in front of a senior class and called it trash, not worth $1. The third paragraph quoted Theodore Bennett in a single sentence. "A teacher destroyed it. A school nearly silenced her. The Whitney saw what they refused to see." By 8 in the morning, the story had 100,000 shares. By noon, an NYU art historian published a paper arguing that Loretta Reed's psychological portrait technique had been 30 years ahead of its time, and that her recovered diaries contained references to seeing emotion as color, a rare condition called synesthesia, documented to run in families. He did not name Amara. He did not have to. By 2 in the afternoon, Brittany Sinclair quietly unfollowed Catherine Whitmore on Instagram. By 3, Dean Edmund Faulkner called an emergency meeting and rescinded the suspension. By 4, Catherine Whitmore had hired a public relations firm. By 5, she had given a statement to a sympathetic blog claiming she could not specifically recall the student in question and that the restored work was, in her professional opinion, substantially a collaboration with the conservator. She held up a small framed fragment of charcoal paper, the missing piece from the lower left corner, and described it as material she had carefully preserved on the day of the incident. That evening, Theodore Bennett went on a podcast he had refused for 20 years. He said 3 things. The Kozo paper inlay had been a deliberate artistic choice. The missing fragment was the point of the work. Its erasure was its meaning. And then, someone in that institution knows exactly where that fragment is. They have been holding it since the afternoon the drawing was torn. I will not name her. The paper trail will. The podcast hit 1 million downloads in 4 days. Amara did not give an interview. She did not answer the phone calls from CNN, The Atlantic, or Vanity Fair. She sat at the kitchen table in the South Bronx and drew her grandmother from the only black and white photograph she had, a young woman in 1962 with a charcoal pencil tucked behind her ear, smiling at someone the camera could not see. She posted the drawing to the anonymous account she had not touched in 3 weeks. The caption was 4 words long. She drew me first. Margaret Holloway issued the only press statement Amara would ever authorize. The artist has chosen to let the work speak. The work has already said everything. By Monday morning, "Let the Work Speak" was trending in 17 countries. A teenage girl in Lagos painted it on a canvas and held it up at a protest. People who had never set foot in a museum found themselves arguing about a black girl from the Bronx and a teacher who had torn her drawing in half. That Tuesday, the Whitney announced that after the biennial closed, the restored portrait would be sold at Sotheby's Contemporary Evening Sale, 60% of proceeds to Amara Reed, 40% to a new endowment named the Loretta Reed Foundation for Women Artists of Color. The pre-sale estimate was $300,000 to $500,000. Then a single line appeared in the release. The billionaire collector Augustus Caldwell, famous for rejecting a Basquiat the previous year, had announced he would attend the auction in person. And Catherine Whitmore, sitting in her Greenwich kitchen reading the release on her phone, finally understood that the rope around her own neck had been pulled by her own hand. The Whitney Biennial opened on a Thursday evening. The portrait hung alone on a fifth-floor wall, lit from above by a single warm spotlight that fell exactly across the blank square of Kozo paper. The wound at the lower left corner had been turned into a doorway. People walked past it and went silent. Some stood for 10 minutes. 2 strangers cried in front of it within the first hour, holding hands without knowing each other's names. Yolanda Reed wore the only dress she owned that was not a uniform. Amara had washed and pressed it the night before, by hand, in the kitchen sink. The two of them stood at the edge of the room and did not speak. Yolanda looked at her own face on the wall for 20 full minutes. She did not cry. She did not move. She held her daughter's hand the way a woman holds a candle in a wind. Augustus Caldwell approached them at the end of the evening. He was 81 years old, bald, narrow, in a charcoal suit, leaning on a walnut cane. He did not extend a hand to shake. He had read about her. "Miss Reed," he said, "last spring I turned down a Basquiat at auction. The estimate was $9 million. I told the room it lacked an interior." He paused. "I will not be turning down what is on that wall." He nodded once to Yolanda. He left. 3 blocks south, in the offices of Whitmore's new legal team, papers were being drafted through the night. By the following morning, Catherine Whitmore had filed a formal claim of partial authorship of the restored work, naming Theodore Bennett, Margaret Holloway, the Whitney Museum, the Carrington Institute, and Amara Reed in her pleadings. She demanded 60% of any future sale proceeds. She announced that she would personally attend the auction at Sotheby's and present on the public floor the missing fragment as evidence of her long-standing stewardship of the piece. Her statement to the New York Times described it as the artwork's true provenance. By Friday, 3 op-eds had appeared. By Saturday, a silent protest at the Carrington Institute had filled the courtyard with 78 students, every one of them holding a blank sheet of white paper above their heads. By Sunday, paparazzi were sleeping in cars outside the apartment building in the South Bronx. A literary agent left an envelope under the Reed's door containing a $400,000 advance for a memoir Amara had not agreed to write. Amara slid the envelope back into the hallway unopened. A second envelope arrived the next morning, this time offering $600,000. She slid that one back too. On the night before the auction, Bennett took Amara down to his studio one last time. From a flat archival drawer beneath his desk, he removed a single sealed envelope. The paper inside was thin and yellowed. The handwriting was her grandmother's. It was a letter Loretta Reed had written in 1991 from a bed in a public hospital to a friend who had outlived her. The friend had given it to Bennett 20 years later. The letter described a meeting on Madison Avenue in the spring of 1985. A gallery owner had looked at 12 of Loretta's drawings, smiled politely, and said the work was not commercially viable for our clientele. The gallery owner's name appeared 3 times in the letter. Harold Whitmore. Amara read the letter twice. She looked up. She understood, for the first time, that what had happened in her classroom was not the cruelty of one woman. It was the second verse of a song that had been sung in this city for 41 years. Sotheby's contemporary evening sale was held 2 evenings later in the main sales room at York Avenue and 72nd. 380 seats, closed to the public, carried live on the auction house's global feed. 8 phone banks staffed by specialists in Paris, Hong Kong, London, Geneva, Tokyo, Doha, Sao Paulo, and Riyadh. Lot 18, Mother, after the night shift. Charcoal on antique sketchbook paper, conserved with Japanese inlay. Estimate, $300,000 to $500,000. Amara sat in row 22 on the aisle beside her mother. She wore the oldest sweater she owned because she could not bear new fabric against her skin when she needed to keep still. She did not look up at the front of the room. She counted in her head the way she had since she was 7. The auctioneer opened bidding at $250,000. The paddle went up. 300, 350. The room hummed. 400, 500. A phone bid from Paris in 40 seconds flat. 600, 700, 800,000, also from a phone, this time London. Then 900. 1 million from a paddle near the back. The room began to lean forward in its seats. Augustus Caldwell raised his paddle for the first time at 1,000,002. The room exhaled. 1,000,005 from Tokyo. 1,000,008 from Caldwell. 1,950,000 from the phone bank in Geneva. The auctioneer scanned the room. He raised his gavel. That was when Catherine Whitmore stood up. She had been sitting in row 4 with her lawyer, dressed in slate gray, holding a small framed object on her lap. She walked forward, into the aisle, into the camera lights, lifting the frame above her shoulders so the back row could see. "I am formally requesting a pause of this lot," she said, in the carrying voice of a woman who had taught for 20 years. "I am in possession of an original fragment of the work, removed before any restoration occurred, which speaks to a contested chain of authorship. I require that fragment to be examined before this gavel falls." The salesroom went silent. Somewhere near the front, a phone bidder gasped audibly into a receiver. The auctioneer set down his gavel. Sotheby's chief specialist crossed the floor and accepted the frame from Whitmore's hand. He carried it to the front of the room and laid it on a velvet table beneath a magnifying lamp. Theodore Bennett rose from his seat in row 11. He asked, in a quiet voice that the live feed picked up cleanly, for permission to examine the fragment. Permission was granted. He walked forward. He put on a pair of cotton gloves. He turned the frame around. The magnifying lamp lit the backside of the paper. In the lower right corner of the reverse, faint but legible, in a hand that had not held a pencil for 22 years, was a signature. L. R. for Y. 1988. Bennett looked up. Margaret Holloway, seated in row 1, stood and walked to the table. She studied the inscription. She turned to the auctioneer. She spoke clearly enough for the live feed. "This sheet of paper," she said, "was a gift from Loretta Reed to her daughter Yolanda in 1988, when Yolanda was 8 years old. It has been the legal property of the Reed family for 38 years. The fragment in this frame was not preserved by anyone outside that family. It was taken." The auctioneer turned to Sotheby's general counsel, who had risen from a chair near the wall. The counsel nodded once and said audibly, "We have a determination." Every camera in the room turned toward Catherine Whitmore. She did not speak. She did not move for a long moment. The color left her face in a single wave. Then she walked back through the aisle she had just walked up. At the table, she laid the frame down very carefully, as though it had become heavy. She kept walking. She walked out of the salesroom and onto York Avenue and into a black car waiting at the curb. A photographer caught the moment the car door closed. The photograph would appear on every front page in the country by morning. Her face would appear beside it. So would the words she had used in that classroom. So would the headline. The rope she had pulled was tightening on no one's neck but her own. The auctioneer waited until the door at the back of the room had clicked shut. Then he picked up the gavel again. "We are at 1,950,000. Are there any further bids?" Augustus Caldwell raised his paddle without looking at it. 2 million. Silence. The phone banks held still. The gavel fell. In row 22 on the aisle, Yolanda Reed reached across and took her daughter's hand. The hand of a cleaner and the hand of an artist. Amara did not look up. She closed her eyes and let her mother feel the pulse in her wrist.
Augustus Caldwell did not approach row 22 until the sales room had emptied of half its bidders. He walked the long way around, his cane tapping softly on the polished floor. He did not offer his hand. He knew, somehow, that she would not have taken it. He set a business card down on the empty seat beside Amara. Cream paper, his initials embossed in a single dark blue line. "Your grandmother saw colors no one else could see," he said. "You see the same. I just bought your future." He paused. "Not because you spoke for it, because you did not have to." He looked at Yolanda for a long moment. He did not say anything to her. He nodded the way one tired soldier nods to another after a long march. He left. A Sotheby's specialist returned the missing fragment to Amara in a small velvet sleeve. She held the sleeve in her lap. She opened her backpack. She took out the leather sketchbook her grandmother had left her. She slid the fragment back into the seam where it had been torn out, the way one sets a bone. Then she closed the cover. For the first time in 40 years, the book was whole. At the front of the room, Margaret Holloway addressed the remaining press in a single quiet sentence. 40% of the proceeds, $800,000, would establish the Loretta Reed Foundation for Women Artists of Color, supporting first-generation black women painters who could not afford fine art school. Theodore Bennett did not approach the front. He stood at the back of the room, near the door he had walked through 1,000 times on other people's behalf. He caught Amara's eye across the rows. He placed one hand flat on his own chest for a single second. He left. Yolanda stood. She picked up her coat. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "I'm taking the night shift off. First time in 18 years. Amara stood. She slung her backpack over her shoulder. She took her mother's hand. They walked out of Sotheby's. They did not call a taxi. They walked 4 blocks east through the cold Manhattan evening to the entrance of the 6 train. They went home the way they had always gone home. The photograph of Catherine Whitmore stepping into the black car on York Avenue ran on the front page of every major American newspaper the next morning. 11 days after the auction, Dean Edmund Faulkner announced she had voluntarily stepped down from her chairmanship to focus on personal research. The phrasing did not survive the news cycle. By Friday, 4 former Carrington students, 3 black women and 1 Dominican-American woman, had given on-the-record interviews describing nearly identical incidents stretching back 12 years. The following Monday, a coalition of 14 alumni had retained a civil rights attorney and filed suit against the Institute for systemic discrimination. The New Yorker investigation ran 3 weeks later, 15,000 words. The title was The Gatekeeper of Carrington. It traced the line backwards through 41 years, from a torn drawing in a senior studio in 2026 to a 1985 viewing room on Madison Avenue, where a man named Harold Whitmore had quietly rejected 12 drawings by a Bronx mother of 1. It named 6 other black women painters his gallery had refused between 1981 and 1998. 2 were still living. Both were interviewed. By autumn, the state board had moved to revoke Catherine Whitmore's teaching credential. 3 other private art schools rescinded the visiting lectureships they had offered her. A Madison Avenue gallery that had agreed to consign her own paintings withdrew the offer in writing. She sold the Greenwich house at a loss. She moved to a town of 4,000 people in northern Vermont. She did not paint again. Amara Reed enrolled at Yale School of Art in the autumn. The admissions committee waived the bachelor's degree requirement under a clause reserved for artists who had already exhibited in a national museum. She accepted the offer on the condition that she would not be required to speak in seminars. The school agreed in writing. It became the first such accommodation in its 100-year history. David Zwerner and Hauser and Worth both sent her letters offering exclusive representation. She declined both. She stayed close to Margaret Holloway and continued to draw in the basement studio at Carrington whenever she was in the city. The Atlantic published a profile titled, "The Quietest Genius in Contemporary Art." She did not read it. Yolanda Reed stopped working night shifts. She kept the day job at Bronx General because, she said, the patients on her floor still needed someone to talk to them at 6 in the morning. She joined the board of the Loretta Reed Foundation and reviewed applications on Saturday mornings in her uniform. Theodore Bennett was offered the directorship of Carrington's Department of Conservation. He declined. He continued to teach classical drawing in the basement studio. He took on 4 new students that spring, all of them scholarship recipients, all of them first generation, none of them required to speak when they did not wish to. The Whitney Museum acquired 8 surviving works by Loretta Reed for its permanent collection. 2 were installed on the 5th floor beside a placard naming her as an artist whose recognition arrived too late and is now overdue. A PBS documentary on her life and her granddaughters went into production the following year. Brittany Sinclair withdrew her own work from the Cornerstone exhibition. The following year, she transferred out of the fine art program entirely and began a degree in art history. And one morning, 3 months after the auction, Amara walked the long way down the basement hallway one final time. She did not knock. She set the leather sketchbook on Bennett's work table. She did not say goodbye. He did not ask her to. The book had done its work. A piece of paper is worth nothing in the morning. By midnight, the same paper is worth $2 million. What changed between those 2 hours was not the paper. What changed was whether the world was finally willing to look at it. Real talent does not ask permission to exist. It exists before anyone notices it, and it goes on existing long after the people who denied it have been forgotten. Loretta Reed died in a public hospital in 2004 with no gallery, no obituary, no buyer. 40 years later, her granddaughter's hand finished the sentence her grandmother had been writing all along. The story did not need a louder voice. It needed a witness. The cruelty in that classroom was not invented by Catherine Whitmore. It was inherited. Her father did it on Madison Avenue in 1985. Injustice, repeated across generations, is not erased by silence. It is only erased when one person refuses to look away from the work that everyone else has been trained to walk past. A torn drawing can be restored with Japanese paper and patience. A torn human being is harder, but not impossible. It takes a teacher in a basement who decides, at 2 in the morning, that a stranger's mother is worth weeping for. It takes a curator who walks past a corner of a studio and stops. It takes a billionaire who has spent 40 years learning when to keep his paddle down and one night when to raise it. It takes a mother who walked 70 blocks in the cold rather than spend the subway fare so her daughter could keep holding a pencil. Money is not the measure of art. $2 million is just the world's apology for 40 years of silence. The real measure is the $800,000 now sitting in a foundation in Loretta Reed's name, waiting for the next black girl in the South Bronx who has not yet been told she is allowed to draw. If this story moved you, comment the word "read" below. Like the video if you believe talent has no color. Share it with someone who has ever been told their gift was worth nothing. And subscribe, because the next Amara is already sitting in the back row of a classroom, waiting to be seen. #Justice for Amara.
The story is over, but one thing keeps sticking with me. We like to believe cruelty comes from cruel people, bad apples. If we could just find them and remove them, the problem would be solved. But this story taught me something darker. Cruelty isn't easily born, it's inherited. When somebody is cruel to you, they are rarely inventing it. They are repeating something they were taught by a parent, a bot, a culture, somebody who was cruel to them first. Here's the part nobody likes to admit. We have all done it too. Maybe not on a big scale, but we have all repeated patterns we should have stopped. The tone we hate as kids, we use on our own family. The judgment we resented from teachers, we hand to strangers. We swore we had never become it, and quietly we became it anyway. That's what scares me about this story. The villain isn't one person, it's a chain, and every person in that chain had a chance to stop it and didn't. They tell themselves that's just how the world works. They tell themselves not my place, and the circle kept going. So here's a lesson. You don't have to inherit everything you were given. The circle stops with whoever decided to stop it. That can be you. This week, today, if you were in that classroom, would you have spoken up? I would recommend hit like, subscribe. See you next time.